They call it noble. They call it virtuous. They say to give yourself fully, to sacrifice for others, to put yourself last. They say this is what makes you good, selflessness. But Sigmund Freud would raise an eyebrow. Because beneath the applause for your humility, beneath the praise for your compassion, Freud saw something far darker. Not sainthood, not strength, but repression. Freud didn't believe your selflessness made you pure. He believed it made you dangerous, to yourself and to others. Why? Because when you give everything away, when you smile while saying yes, when you suppress your needs in the name of kindness, what you're really doing is burying your rage, your unmet needs, your real self. And the unconscious does not forget. To Freud, selflessness wasn't a moral victory. It was a psychological time bomb. Every sacrifice you make that isn't truly yours builds pressure. Every time you deny yourself, you carve a deeper trench in the psyche. And in that trench, resentment grows. But because you're trying to be good, you never admit it. You just keep giving. Until one day, you explode. And no one sees it coming. Not your friends, not your partner, not even you. Because your selflessness taught you to wear a mask. The mask of the helper, the peacemaker, the silent saint. But Freud knew that what's repressed always returns. If not in rage, then in sickness. If not in words, then in sabotage. If not toward others, then toward yourself. This is why Freud warned against moral absolutism, the kind that tells you to always be generous, to always understand, to always care, because no one is always anything. And when you pretend to be, you split yourself in half. Your public self glows with virtue, but your private self begins to rot. And that's what society encourages. They don't want you to question your selflessness, because selfless people are useful, easy to ask favors from, easy to exploit, easy to drain. All they have to do is tell you it's noble, that it's love, that it's maturity. And you'll keep giving, not because you want to, but because you're afraid not to. Afraid of being called selfish, afraid of being judged, afraid of being abandoned. But Freud would say, that fear is the real signal. The thing you're hiding under your selflessness is your deepest truth. And truth, when buried, becomes poison. It twists everything. It turns generosity into obligation, kindness into manipulation, love into quiet self-erasure. You tell yourself you're doing it for others, but Freud knew you're doing it to keep the peace, to feel worthy, to avoid guilt, to avoid the confrontation that might come if you ever said what you actually need. Because saying I need is dangerous in a world that loves to shame desire. Saying I want threatens the system. Saying no threatens your relationships. So you become the helper, the fixer, the one who never complains. And everyone calls you strong. But strength without boundaries isn't strength. It's decay. Freud believed that people who never seem angry, who never seem selfish, who never assert themselves, are the ones most likely to suffer internal collapse. Not because they're weak, but because they've split themselves from their instinct. And instincts don't die just because you hide them. They come back in dreams, in addictions, in depression, in anxiety, in the strange moments where you lash out and don't know why, where you cry and don't know what triggered it, where you hate the people you're supposed to love and you don't understand what's wrong with you. But Freud would tell you, nothing is wrong with you. You've just been too selfless for too long. You've been tricked into believing that goodness means silence, that love means self-sacrifice, that maturity means swallowing your truth. And now, your unconscious is rebelling. It wants freedom. It wants honesty. It wants to scream what you've been too afraid to say out loud. I don't want to carry this anymore. I don't want to always say yes. I don't want to be the strong one forever. And that's not weakness. That's the beginning of healing. Because Freud knew that the unconscious is not evil. It's wounded. It carries the parts of you that were never allowed to exist in public. The part that wants. The part that gets angry. The part that wants to be seen, not for what you do for others, but for what you feel when no one's watching. And that's the part that selflessness kills. It makes you invisible to yourself. You begin to value your worth only through the lens of what you give. You measure your day in how useful you were. You gauge your identity in how many people needed you. But Freud would tell you, that's not love. That's dependency. That's performance. And performances always end, sometimes in burnout, sometimes in explosive conflict, sometimes in a quiet numbness that stretches for years. You wake up and realize you don't know who you are anymore. You've spent your life being good, but now you feel nothing. And that's the cost of selflessness. Not just your time, not just your energy, yourself. Because you gave so much, so often to everyone else, you never figured out what you were actually here to protect. And that's why Freud's warning still matters. Not because he hated kindness, but because he knew any virtue that demands you ignore your inner world will eventually destroy you. Selflessness is only sacred when it's chosen, not when it's coerced by guilt, fear, or social praise. You are allowed to have limits. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to disappoint people. You are allowed to protect yourself before serving others. And if you don't, Freud wouldn't be surprised. He'd just say, of course. Of course you're exhausted. Of course you're resentful. Of course you feel empty, because no one told you the truth. Selflessness, when used to erase yourself, is not a virtue. It's a slow form of self-abandonment, and the longer you perform it, the harder it becomes to find your way back. But you can. And the path begins with the most dangerous, most honest, most Freudian act of all. Not saying yes when you mean no. Not smiling when you're breaking. Not thanking people for using you, but looking inward and saying, I deserve to exist for myself too. You've been taught that the opposite of selflessness is selfishness. That if you stop giving, if you protect your energy, if you ask for what you want, you're crossing some moral line. But Freud would say, that's the exact trap they want you stuck in. A binary that keeps you guilty no matter what you choose. Give too much? You feel empty. Give too little. You feel ashamed. So you compromise, not because it's healthy, but because you've been trained to believe that your needs are a burden, that speaking up is ungrateful, that wanting more is wrong. And Freud saw this as the deepest psychological lie. Because under every compulsively selfless person, Freud believed, there was a child. A child who learned early that love must be earned, that if they cried too loudly, needed too often, asked too much, they would be punished, or ignored, or abandoned. So they learned to reverse the equation. Be helpful, be quiet, be what everyone else needs, and maybe they'll stay. And that pattern never stopped. It just changed clothes. Now you're the one they rely on. You're the one who fixes, who listens, who carries. And maybe they do stay. Maybe they even praise you for it. But that praise, it doesn't feel real anymore, because deep down, you know what it cost. And Freud would say, what you repress always becomes resentment. Resentment you're too polite to name. Resentment you convert into fatigue. Resentment that leaks out when you start hoping people fail just so they'll stop asking you for help. Resentment that makes you fantasize, not about hurting them, but about disappearing altogether. That's the shadow of selflessness. The side no one talks about. The side that Freud studied obsessively. He knew that the psyche has a breaking point, that the mask of the helper doesn't just slip, it shatters. And when it does, your rage doesn't come out clean. It comes out confused, passive-aggressive, self-destructive. You don't explode on others. You implode. You stop taking care of yourself. You cancel your goals. You sabotage your relationships. You unconsciously create situations where you're forced to withdraw, because it's the only way your unconscious can scream, I've had enough. And yet the world still claps for your selflessness. They call you the strong one. They admire your ability to carry everyone else's weight, but no one asks about yours. No one wonders what it's like to never be allowed to fall apart. No one thinks to ask the question Freud would demand, who are you when no one needs you? And more importantly, do you even know how to be that person anymore? This is where Freud's brilliance becomes uncomfortable. He wouldn't let you hide behind virtue. He didn't care if your behavior looked admirable. He cared whether it was authentic, and most chronic selflessness, he believed, wasn't. It was compulsive, a trauma loop, a guilt reflex, a mask carved by fear. He would ask, what do you get out of being selfless? It's not a judgment, it's a diagnosis, because even the most giving people are still human, still driven by unconscious motives. And Freud's genius was in revealing how the mind lies to itself while claiming moral high ground. He knew that selflessness can become a form of control. You give so much that others feel indebted to you. You do everything so they'll never leave. You become so indispensable that they can't reject you because they'd feel guilty. And that guilt? That's power. Silent, hidden, denied, but real. Freud believed that we all bargain with the world. And the selfless person's bargain is this. If I suffer enough, maybe I'll finally be safe. If I disappear for them, maybe they'll see me. If I need nothing, maybe they'll give me something. But the world doesn't work like that. The world does not reward the most selfless. It rewards the most clear, the most boundaried, the most whole. And wholeness doesn't come from shrinking your needs. It comes from honoring them, loudly, sharply, without apology. That's not selfishness. That's psychological integration. It's the moment you stop breaking yourself into pieces for others' comfort. The moment you realize that every time you say yes to someone else, you're saying no to a part of yourself. And Freud would demand to know which part that is. Is it your time, your energy, your ambition, your peace? Because if you keep cutting those pieces out, eventually there's nothing left but performance. A smile that hides resentment. A life that looks kind, but feels hollow. A persona that serves everyone, except you. And Freud would say, there is no virtue in disappearing. There is only delay. A delay of your anger, a delay of your truth, a delay of your becoming. So what happens when you stop being selfless? At first, people panic. They call you cold, distant, difficult, because they were never in love with you. They were in love with your usefulness. But Freud would tell you, let them go. The ones who love your performance will flee. But the ones who see your truth, they will stay. And they will meet the real you. The one who doesn't live on guilt. The one who doesn't need to be needed. The one who is finally, fully alive. You've been taught to admire the person who gives everything. The mother who sacrifices. The friend who never says no. The partner who loves without condition. But Freud would ask, at what cost? Because while the world praises the selfless, it rarely examines the emotional wreckage they leave behind, inside themselves. You don't notice it at first. You feel helpful, needed, important. But slowly, something shifts. You begin to disappear. Your preferences vanish. Your time isn't your own. Your body carries stress that doesn't belong to you. And worst of all, you start to feel guilty when you even think about choosing yourself. That's not virtue. That's programming. Freud would point to the superego, the internalized voice of society, parents, teachers, culture, the one whispering rules about how you should behave. Be nice, be good, be generous. And if you don't, you're selfish, you're bad, you're unlovable. But here's the twist Freud exposed. The superego isn't your conscience, it's your captor. It demands perfection. It thrives on guilt. It doesn't care about your wholeness, only your compliance. And selflessness, when weaponized, becomes its favorite tool. It convinces you that your needs are dangerous, that your desires are shameful, that the only way to be safe is to erase yourself. So you do, bit by bit. You turn down what you want. You overextend in relationships. You ignore the fatigue. You silence the anger. You apologize for wanting more. And it works, temporarily. People like you. You're seen as dependable, admirable. But inside, something starts to rot. Because while you're meeting everyone else's expectations, your real self is being starved. And Freud knew that starved parts of the psyche don't die quietly. They find other ways out. In nightmares, in obsessive thoughts, in addictions, in body aches with no medical cause, in sudden outbursts that feel like someone else took over. Because someone did. The part of you that you've silenced for years, the part that's sick of being last, sick of being agreeable, sick of being used, is clawing its way back. And when it returns, it doesn't ask permission. This is what Freud called the return of the repressed. The truth always comes back. And the more selfless you've been, the more violently it arrives. Because repression doesn't erase, it compounds. And yet, even in your breakdown, people might still call you strong. Because they don't see the cost. They don't see the breakdown behind the calm voice. They don't see the panic behind the smile. They don't see the 1,000 tiny betrayals you've committed against yourself in the name of being good. But Freud would. He'd ask you, where did you first learn that disappearing was how you earned love? Because that's where it begins. Not in adulthood, in childhood. The moment you realize that being too loud, too demanding, too angry, too emotional meant losing someone's affection. So you adapted. You became the helper, the soother, the one who kept the peace. And in doing so, you abandoned yourself. But Freud's entire philosophy was about going back, not to live in the past, but to understand what shaped you. And selflessness, he would say, often begins as a survival strategy. It isn't noble. It's protective. It's not generosity. It's a mask. And if you wear it long enough, you forget you ever had a face beneath it. That's why people who break out of this pattern often experience an identity crisis. They don't know how to say no. They don't know how to receive. They feel uncomfortable when someone offers to help, because for so long their worth was measured in how much they could endure. But Freud would say, that's not a personality, it's a trauma response, and it's reversible. You don't have to stay the savior. You don't have to be the emotional dumping ground. You don't have to be the reliable one every time. You don't have to feel guilty when you choose yourself. Because true self-worth doesn't come from giving until you collapse. It comes from integration, from owning your needs, your anger, your fear, your desire, and not apologizing for any of it. That's the path Freud pointed to. Not repression, but confrontation. Look at your motives. Look at your patterns. Look at the parts of you you've labeled bad just because they wanted something real. Wanting isn't bad. Saying no isn't bad. Protecting your energy isn't selfish. It's survival. It's power. It's truth. And Freud would argue, you cannot love others if you are constantly lying to yourself. You cannot serve others if your service is a performance. You cannot help others if your help is fueled by fear. You cannot build relationships if they're built on a version of you that doesn't exist anymore. So when people tell you you've changed because you stopped being selfless, thank them, because you have changed. You stopped bleeding for applause. You stopped handing over your life in exchange for validation. You stopped being everything for everyone. Because you finally realized you were never nothing to begin with. You were just too busy carrying everyone else to realize how heavy your own soul had become. But Freud saw it. And now, so do you. There comes a moment, quiet, undramatic, when the selfless person looks in the mirror and doesn't recognize themselves. Not because they've changed, but because they've been missing from their own life for so long, they forgot what wholeness feels like. Freud would call this moment the return of the repressed self, the part of you that's waited, silently, for years, watching you nod politely when you wanted to scream, watching you smile as someone else took from you again, watching you applaud your own erasure. And this moment is terrifying, because when that repressed self finally returns, it doesn't come asking for permission. It comes demanding reality. You start saying no. You stop responding instantly. You cancel plans. You challenge the nice version of yourself that everyone was addicted to. You break the script. And when you do, the people who depended on your silence will panic. They'll say you've changed, that you've become cold, that you're not as kind as you used to be. But Freud would smile. Because these aren't insults. They're proof. Proof that the mask is off. Proof that your unconscious is no longer on autopilot. Proof that your inner child is no longer being sacrificed for the sake of harmony. Because let's be brutally honest, most of the time, selflessness isn't love. It's control. Control over how others see us. Control over their reactions. Control over the possibility of abandonment. You give more than you can afford, not because it makes you happy, but because you're terrified of what might happen if you stop. If you stop being the dependable one, the loyal one, the caretaker, who are you? What's left? And that's the real fear. Freud would call this a crisis of ego identity. The good self you built, the helper, the giver, the strong one, isn't a lie, but it's incomplete. It's a character, and you've played it so well that you don't know how to be anything else. And when you try to step out of it, you feel disoriented, guilty, even unsafe. But that's not a sign you're doing something wrong. That's the symptom of detoxing from a lifetime of false virtue. Because you were never meant to live your life as a reaction to others' needs. You were meant to create, to feel, to desire, to live in full color, not just in service. Freud said the unconscious doesn't care about what's socially acceptable. It cares about what's true. And when your truth has been suffocated by a selfless image, the unconscious starts revolting. It makes you sabotage. It makes you lash out. It makes you withdraw. It makes you sick. Not because you're weak, because the lie is too heavy. And this is where Freud flips the narrative entirely. He doesn't praise selflessness. He warns against it. Because unchecked, selflessness becomes martyrdom. And martyrdom is seductive. It makes you feel noble while guaranteeing your own destruction. That's why people cling to it, because it gives them a sense of identity. It lets them suffer with purpose. It lets them say, look at how much I gave, instead of admitting, I never believed I was allowed to keep anything for myself. But Freud's work is about excavation, about digging up the roots of your behavior, not to shame them, but to liberate you from them. And if you trace your selflessness back far enough, what do you find? Fear of abandonment, fear of conflict, fear of being disliked, fear of being seen as selfish. But what if selfish was never the enemy? What if in a world that rewards overextension, being selfish is the only path back to sanity? Not in the narcissistic sense, but in the sovereign sense. The version of you who gives by choice, not by compulsion. Who helps because they want to, not because they're afraid not to. Who knows that true connection requires two whole people, not one person giving everything and the other taking it all. That's Freud's final point. Balance is not found through denial. It's found through awareness. When you become aware of your patterns, you gain choice. When you gain choice, you gain power. And when you gain power, you no longer have to beg for love with your own suffering. You can say no without explanation. You can rest without guilt. You can ask without apology. You can love without disappearing. And the people who truly see you won't be threatened by your boundaries. They'll be grateful for your honesty. Because no one can form a real connection with someone who's hiding behind a virtue mask. No one can trust someone who doesn't even know what they need. And no one can love someone who's so busy being selfless, they've forgotten how to be human. So stop. Stop being the one who always understands. Stop being the one who always forgives. Stop being the one who always puts themselves last. Because you were not put on this earth to prove your worth through sacrifice. You were put here to become. Fully, fiercely, freely. And that becoming starts the moment you realize that Freud wasn't attacking kindness. He was attacking compulsion and freeing you from the prison of being good at the cost of being real.